Today we're diving into a cool camera trick that can completely change the way your footage looks. Undercranking. The problem is that many mirrorless and DSLRs do not really let you do this, well, at least not on the surface. I'll be going over a step-by-step on how you're able to do this, but more on that in a bit. So you've probably seen shots like this. That's undercranking. Or like this. That's also undercranking. This is a camera technique that is achieved when you record at a lower frame rate than the typical 24 or 30 frames per second. And when you play back that footage in normal speed, it appears a lot faster than in real life. This is side-by-side comparison of a 24 frames per second clip versus a 12 frames per second clip. And this is what it looks like compared to an 8 frames per second clip. And this is what it looks like compared to a 2 frames per second clip. This technique actually dates back to the early days of cinema when to capture film, you needed to crank the camera. If you crank that camera slower, you'll capture less frames per second. Hence the word undercranking. There are many creative ways you can use undercranking, and here are a few. For example, you can use them during action sequences or fight sequences. It makes movement looks more intense and more energetic. You can undercrank a camera to capture time lapses. If you don't have the time to do all the time lapse post-processing, but want to emulate fast motion or the fast passage of time, undercranking is a way of doing it. You can also create dreamlike or surreal effects with undercranking as well. Undercranking can also make a sequence a little bit more funny and comedic as well, especially if you add in a bit of a funny soundtrack to it. This makes actions feel exaggerated and a bit more cartoonish. So how do you undercrank on your mirrorless camera? I'll show you how this is done with Sony cameras, but this can also be translated to other cameras. You just need to find the equivalent name of that feature in your camera brand. Normally, you can't really shoot lower than 24 or 30 frames per second. But if you turn your camera to SNQ mode on a Sony, the only drawback with this though is that it does not record any sound. Now you can go into menu, go into SNQ settings, slow and quick. Recording frame rate, this will be the actual output of that playback of that video. I'll leave that at 24. And here I can set the frame rate and I can go lower than 30 and 24. I can do 15, 8, 4, 2, or 1 frames per second. 1 frames per second is very useful if you're shooting a time lapse and want it to be compiled in camera. And 4, 8, 15, these ones are good for very creative undercranking effects. So I can select 8 frames per second. Now you can see that it says 8 frames per second right here. And it says quick times 3 times speed. Now you can go to adjust the shutter speed depending on how much motion blur you want. If I'm shooting at 8 frames per second, then maybe I can double that, maybe keep it around 1/15 of a shutter. Or you can exaggerate that motion blur by lowering that shutter speed, or increasing it if you want the opposite. And because this is done directly in camera, you're able to preview the actual effect and what it looks like. So that's how you undercrank on a mirrorless camera. I hope that this video was useful to you. If you're still watching, please consider subscribing. Let me know in what other creative ways you use undercranking for your videos. I would love to hear about them. And if you're still watching, here are a couple more videos you could probably watch next, and I'll see you there.